So before you put in the tubing, you have two packages. You have an inflow tubing, which is blue, and you have an outflow tubing, which is yellow. This is menu driven. We're going to turn it on, and before we insert the tubing, and we're going to let it go through its system check. And you see right here, system check running, system OK.
Okay.
And then it says insert tube set. Before we insert the tube set, we want to make sure everything is hooked up correctly. You have two vacuum pumps built into this unit, so you don't use wall vacuum. You have two pumps, so you can place this anywhere in the room. My recommendation is put it next to the circulator where the circulator sits, so they can keep an eye on it. Low side, I hook to the center is the main source of vacuum. And the same thing on the high side. These tubes, by the way, are not throwaway. These right here. Okay? Make sure the canister lids are on tight and they're sealed up. If they're not, you won't get any vacuum. Okay? And on the back, you'll notice once again you have a low pump, low suction, and high suction. The high suction can regulate from 150 to 650 millimeters of mercury vacuum. I usually leave it just below medium. The low side is a steady 150 millimeters of mercury vacuum. That's good just for your hysteroscopy. When you're doing hysteroscopy, use the low side. Okay? The high side is designated, if you're using MyoSure, what you would do is just hook it right up to the tissue sock that's on the high side. So what you end up with is designated suction for the scope and under buttock straight, and designated suction for the MyoSure device. Okay? So our inflow tubing, the blue side, we're going to hook up to the scope. And this can be draped or undraped. And if you wouldn't mind, if you'd be my circulator, I'll throw this off to you. And at the end, you'll see a block in there, that square block. There's a microchip in there. These sets are intended for one-time use. So once you slide it in, don't take it out or you have to get another tube set. You'll see an arrow on the side, and you see instructions right here. So what it does is it just slides in with the arrow that way. Okay. The arrow facing out. Yep. Pull this around. Pull it hard. Lift it up above the
So that's
ridge.
like the striker.
Okay. And then go ahead and spike it into the bag. Now one thing that is sensitive about this machine, and you have to be very careful of, is that you don't have kinked tubing. So when you spike the bag, some people spike it and keep turning it and turning it, and this right here, oh, you got good ones. They can't kink. I love that. So we don't have to worry about it on the bags that you're using. The inflow is measured of every rotation of this wheel. So if that was kinked, it thinks it's pushing fluid, but it's not. But I love those bags. You don't have to worry about that. Okay? And you want to unspike it, make sure it's open. And that's all set. And the next one is our outflow tubing. Now the outflow tubing, remember I was saying how there's a low side and a high side to the vacuum? We're going to be using the low side, 150 millimeters of mercury vacuum. Because of that, we don't want to drape the outflow over the patient, because what that would require is the suction to pull it up and then back down. So I always recommend just hooking the little yellow to your outflow on the scope, and then just throw it between the legs. Okay? So, If you can take that, we're going to take our under buttock drape and we're going to move this to the side. Now, one of the most important things that I can't stress enough is how you drape that patient. Oh, that works. Nope, nope. There we go. Hang on, take it down. So if there's something I can stress the most in this video and for people to watch, when you drape the patient, the biggest mistake that's made is the patient's buttocks is back here, and a lot of times this is sitting like this. The water can't get down to the bag. Make sure this is nice and flush and have the patient's buttocks hanging over the bag so the water has nowhere to go but in the bag. Okay? So that's up there. The yellow is going to go to the under buttock drape.
The big yellow.
The big yellow. And that's shorter than the white one. So the white one is going to come over to the low side. And the pump right there. Okay? Our tubing is all set up. So to start the pump, I'm going to have you come on this side and work this. So to start the pump, basically there's only a few things we have to do. What it's telling you to do right now is press the prime button. We're going to hold off 1 second. But by pressing the prime button, what you're going to do is calibrate this pump to this specific scope. So if you change scopes, you go from diagnostic to operative, you reprime.
Okay.
Right, you calibrate. If you don't, you're going to hear a beep, it's going to shut down, and it's going to say press prime button.
Okay.
Remove the scope from the patient, reprime.
Okay.
Okay? The other settings we have to do is we have to set what we want our uterine pressure to be. My suggestion, and this is with AORN or AAGL, the recommendation is to start at the mean arterial pressure. And the reason for that, if you think about it, if you're looking into a uterine cavity, and you ever see the pulses of bleeding sometimes?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for mean arterial is 70, and that means it's bleeding in at 70.
Okay.
So if you put if you put the pump pressure at 70, then theoretically you tamponade that bleeding, and you reduce the risk of intravasation because
Right.
you're below the mean arterial pressure. That being said, in theory, that's great, but sometimes you have to go above the mean arterial to really tamponade that bleeding and clear your field of view. But that's why you're using a fluid management system, so you can monitor and watch the deficit at the same time. So once again, my recommendation, ask anesthesia what's her mean arterial pressure. Let's say it's 85. We'll set that for 85. And what that tells you is our pressure is set for 85. This upper number tells you what it actually is while you're working. The next thing we have to determine is your deficit. Where do you want the machine to start alarming? Do you guys have a cutoff?
That's all the docs. Well,
It's up to the docs?
that's up to the docs.
Okay. Once again, AAGL, ACOG, the maximum recommendation they have is 2,500 for saline.
Okay.
I think it's 1,500 for glycine, sorbitol, mannitol. You all determine what that is, but in some facilities they say it's 2,500. So they'll set the deficit for 2,000. And the reason they set it for 2,000, there's nothing worse than you all working this every day than telling a doctor, you gotta stop. So if you go to 2,000, right, you got a little bit of runway left. By setting that to 2,000, what's going to happen is this green bar is going to go from green to yellow to red once you hit 2,000. Once it hits 2,000, you can always go up. The maximum is 2,500. Okay? Your pressure, the maximum pressure setting that you can go on this is 150. Now, once you hit 100, it beeps. Take your finger off, hit it again, and you can go up to 150. Okay, so we're going to bring it back to 85. Okay? So all we've done is we've set what our pressure is, and we've set where we want our deficit to start alarming. The next thing we have to do is prime. So what I'm going to ask you to do is always ask the question, Doc, is your inflow open? It has to be open. They'll hold it over the bag, and if you can hit the prime button. Once again, what's the prime doing? It's going to get the air out, and then it's going to calibrate this pump to this specific scope. And you're going to see this wheel stop and start and stop and start. What I'm also doing now, though, is I'm looking to make sure that my vacuum is working, that my suction is working. When it's done calibrating, you're going to hear a beep, and you're going to get a message there.
Okay.
Okay? What does it say?
Prime successful. Pump operating.
Okay? So I turn off my outflow, my inflow. I open my outflow just to get all the fluid back out. And then what we're going to do is zero it. So if you could press and hold the 0 button, okay? We're ready to roll. Those are the steps.
So it's going from 0 to negative.
Right, it's checking this like multiple times per second.
Okay.
It's extremely sensitive. It's gonna feel the vibrations in the floor even.
Okay.
When you're done though, you pause it and it'll lock in.
Okay.
Okay? So from this point, we're set and ready to work with it.
Right.
A couple things you need to know. You can move this around. You can lean on it.
You can lean on it?
You can put things on top of it.
Okay.
I wouldn't recommend sitting on it.
Okay.
You can add a bag of fluid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? The only time you have to pause this machine is if you're touching those canisters.
Okay.
So you can't
The
change
pause button is right there.
Okay.
However, nobody ever remembers to pause it,
Does
right?
it pause it all the time?
You've seen it. So the minute you touch it,
The pressure.
that paused it.
Yeah.
That turned off your inflow and your pumps.
Okay.
Do your canister change and resume. When we designed this, we went to nurses. Usually we go to doctors. With this is something that the nurses use. And we asked them, what do we need to have on this? That was a main priority. They said, listen, I don't care what pump you're working with, Stryker, Storz, all the pumps that are out there, when you change the fluid or add fluid or touch the canisters, you're supposed to pause it. Guys, I do this for a living. I'm out there every day in a multitude of hospitals. They never do. And you all have seen where the pump deficit goes from 143 to 962 in a matter of seconds. And what it was they didn't pause the system, and they threw
The
everything
system
off.
off. Yeah.
So it's fail-proof.
Good.
You just have to remember to turn it back on.
Okay.
And the menu tells you where you are in the stage. I told you earlier, there's a microchip in the tubing. One of the troubleshooting steps is not to turn it off and turn it on. I know that's a widely used
Right.
troubleshooting method. If you do it with this, you'll get an error message that says insert new tube set.